Greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here. We appreciate the invitation not only to speak but also to sponsor lunch. We did not cook the food, so if it's not good, we're not responsible. If it's great, we're fully responsible. Right? Just real quick to kind of give you a little bit of background. Schneider Electric, we don't make solar panels, we don't make wind turbines, but we make just about everything else it takes to get the energy out of a solar panel or a wind turbine and into your building or into the grid. So when we talk about renewable energy, when it comes to type, the only thing that I'm biased by is the fact that I'm a Texan and I'm a taxpayer and a ratepayer. So as we dive into this a little bit, that's the perspective I'm going to be speaking primarily from. We hear a lot about renewable energy in Texas. When most people think of renewable energy, they think of wind because we have a lot more wind turbines in Texas than we do solar panels. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the market overall from a renewable energy standpoint, and then we're going to talk specifically about Texas, and then we're going to drill down into a little bit more detail about a project that Denise did with the City of Harlingen right here in the Valley. In terms of the overall renewable energy market, these are the things that people tend to think of: solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, hydro, etc. And when you think renewables, I don't want you to get honed in just on solar or just on wind. There are a lot of other things that we can do to generate our own energy. Some facts here about the kind of the amount of each that exists in the United States today. When you think about in terms of ease and cost effectiveness, obviously, starting on the left, we're not building a whole lot more hydropower dams. There are opportunities to do things based on, time of use rates and pumping water uphill into a reservoir at night while energy is cheap, using that to turn a turbine during the day. But in the end, you're not actually saving any energy doing that. So we'll focus primarily on solar and wind in this conversation because they are the predominant forms of renewable energy in Texas. Between the two of them, that's about 70% of the market in the U.S. I want to take just a minute to talk a little bit about the components that go into a renewable energy system, and this could be solar, it could be wind, but obviously on your far right, you see the solar panels, which produce direct current electricity. You've got to run that through an inverter to transform that into AC, run it through a transformer, switchgear, et cetera, and either back into the grid or into your building. And so when you think renewable energy, there's the turbine or there's the panel, but it takes a whole lot to get that energy out of that and into the building or into the grid in a form we can use it. One of the things that, after spending the last 15 years of my career working primarily with school districts, cities, counties on saving energy and saving money, one of the things that struck me is living in Texas, I feel like we have an abundance of sun, yet you don't hear much about solar energy in Texas. And it appears there's a gremlin in the machine here. If you think about where the most solar capacity is, California is the one that always comes to mind, but in reality, Arizona, Colorado, New Jersey, you can't tell me they have more sun in New Jersey than we do in Texas. You look at where Texas ranks, we're just a sliver of the market today. When you think about what drives that, a lot of it is what is in a renewable portfolio standard that utilities have to meet in the state. And it's a little bit of an eye chart. I was thinking we were going to be on a bigger screen, but when you look at what they're required to do in these different states that I've mapped here, in Texas, one of the keys is there's a non-wind goal of 500 megawatts of renewable energy. Well, the overall goal was 5.9 gigawatts. So the part that had to come from solar was very, very small as a percentage of the whole for utilities to meet their renewable portfolio standards. Where this gets to be really important is, so you think about the Pickens plan and T. Boone Pickens with all his wind turbines in North Texas. In reality, I don't think T. Boone Pickens cares that much about renewable energy. I think he's out to make a profit. So after he built all those and got us all pumped up about having them, he sold them off. But I know here in the Valley, you guys have some grid constraints around transmission and distribution. We do in North Texas as well. How many of you guys had brownouts or blackouts last year in August and September? I see a few heads nodding. Well, we did at my house in Dallas as well. And This graph actually comes from the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, and here's why. In a moment, we're going to shift and talk primarily about solar energy. If you look at, these are different dates from the month of August. You look at when that demand peak occurs on the grid in Texas. Look at when the generating peak of our wind assets occurs. If my electric demand is here, but my wind production at the time is here, how much is that helping me? Not a lot. Now I'm going to give you a test to certify you all as renewable energy utility engineers. We'll do this by a show of hands. In Texas, is our demand peak driven more by heating or cooling? If you think it's cooling, raise your hand. You guys are thinking way too hard. This is not a trick question. Is it hotter or colder in Texas? It's hotter, right? So cooling drives our peak. So on the hottest day of the year, is it more likely to be sunny or windy? Right? If it's not sunny, it's probably not going to be the hottest day of the year. Now, this doesn't seem like rocket science, does it? Yet, because of the way we wrote our renewable portfolio standard, we've got oodles and oodles of wind power. And don't get me wrong, I am not against wind. I think it's great. But as a Texan, that didn't prevent me from having blackouts at my house in August. And what we need is a smarter renewable portfolio standard that will have a balanced approach between solar and wind and other resources that can help our grid from a reliability and stability standpoint. So the next time you hear somebody talking about Texas and all our wind power, you might point out that, and this is a stat straight from ERCOT, 8% of the wind generating capacity in the state of Texas can be counted on as reliable at peak times. 8%. So that would be like if we had 100 horsepower worth of wind generation. I realize you don't measure that in horsepower, but I'm trying to create an analogy you can relate to. So 8 horsepower we could actually count on at peak times. The fact that it is slightly cheaper to put up a megawatt wind turbine than a megawatt of solar doesn't do you much good if only 8% of it's available when you need it. Again, not my numbers, that's straight from ERCOT. So if you look at, in 2010, where the majority of solar was being installed, and again, I threw out New Jersey earlier as an example that would make you scratch your head, but there's plenty of others, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. Texas is way down the list. Obviously, that's your hint to keep me moving, right? It's working. So when you'd say, why are these other states so much more active in solar? And if you look at some of the things common to whether it's incentives or grid interconnect or net metering type of standards, you look at, and I realize you can't read this from where you are. I'm happy to share the slides with you afterwards. But if you look at what are enablers of a strong solar energy industry, there's a few key ones that we don't have in Texas. And one would be a unified net metering standard across all the utilities, and another would be a renewable portfolio standard that actually requires much solar. And you can, again, I'll give you the slides, you can look at this other data, but so if you're standing there wondering, Shon, why in the world are you preaching to us about wind versus solar and renewable portfolio standards, et cetera, it's because as Texans, most of us probably know that there are 3 electric grids in the United States, right? There's the East and the West, and then there's Texas, because we like to be independent and do everything our own way, which is great in a lot of circumstances. Unfortunately, what it means, because there's only a couple of connection points with those other grids, is that having all that wind energy doesn't do us a lot of good because we can't even move it around very effectively from other parts of the utility grid. And in Texas, I want my lights on and I want my electricity cheaper. People say, well, solar energy costs more than what I get out of the electrical outlet anyway. And you know what? It does, but not at 4 p.m. on an afternoon in August. Because when your electric utility goes out to buy power on the spot market, they're paying a whole lot more per megawatt hour than it costs to generate a megawatt hour of energy from a solar field. And if we start thinking about the cost of renewable energy, again, we spend a boatload of money on wind, we're not getting as much benefit as we need out of it at peak times. The other key is jobs. I mean, A lot of you guys work for cities or counties. Everywhere I go, the first question I usually get asked is, hey, you guys want to come build a renewable energy manufacturing facility here? San Antonio just did a big solicitation recently looking for people that were going to come in and put in manufacturing there and create jobs. Because we don't have some things that would better enable renewable energy in Texas, it's harder to bring those jobs here. Now, when I think about some of the strengths of Texas in terms of our trained workforce, the central location relative to the country, the strength of our economy, we've got a whole host of reasons companies should want to do this in Texas. I'll tell you as a businessman, there's just about no place in the country that I would less rather do something than California. It's so costly, it's not conveniently located. I'll give you a whole list of reasons why that's not a good place to do it. Yet if you look at where the jobs are going today, they're not going to Texas. A little more on the grand scheme of things relative to solar. When you think about the cost, so this chart basically tracks the cost of an installed watt of solar generating capacity from 2008 to 2011. Is what you can see is, so get my helpful slide gremlin again. Thanks, Denise. So what you can see is it's gone down substantially and actually decreased quite a bit further over the course of 2011. We are approaching what's known as quote-unquote grid parity in a number of areas of the United States, where essentially you can get a kilowatt hour of solar energy as cheaply as you can get a kilowatt hour of energy from whatever your local generating plant is. In Texas, we've got tons of open space, right? Which is one of the reasons the wind developers rushed in, because there's a lot of wide open territory in West Texas. You can throw those things up. But would a giant solar farm in West Texas help you avoid brownouts in the valley? No. Why? Because your ability to transmit and distribute that energy around the state is pretty limited here. Even in North Texas, you can have all the generating capacity in the world. If you can't move the power around, it doesn't do you any good. When you think about what we need to improve the reliability of our power and our grid is localized generation, which is pretty difficult with wind. You see a few wind turbines sticking up. I saw one on the drive up here this morning. But solar, whether it's on roofs or on the land around our buildings, is the best way for us to have the energy at peak times close to where it's going to be consumed. This is a bit of an eye chart that you don't even need to read, but I mentioned earlier, what I do want you to take away is when you think about grid parity relative to the cost of energy, this graph starts in 2009 and runs out through 2030. Now, I'm not a fortune teller, so I can't guarantee anything, but what I can tell you is these different colored bands represent different costs of energy out of your plug. And depending on if you're in a high, medium, or low cost of energy area of the country, and I would say Texas is in what I would call a medium cost of energy area of the country, you can start to see, based on the declining cost of solar power, at what point do we expect grid parity to be here? And these other different ranges are based on different levels of incentive. Short story is, in Texas, if we keep having the kind of things happen that we have over the last few years, and our economy starts to pick back up, electric demand starts to go back up. When you look at the avoided cost of buying a megawatt hour of power on the spot market in August, I think we're going to have a pretty compelling case. I spoke earlier about the renewable portfolio standard in Texas, and I'm not going to pull out a copy of the thing and read it to you, but just some key takeaways. That renewable portfolio standard was written in 1999 as part of Senate Bill 7, and we talked about it on an earlier slide. Almost 6 gigawatts of renewable power were going to be required under that. Only 500 megawatts of that were required to come from solar. So it was a pretty effective way at getting renewable energy built into the grid in Texas. Unfortunately, it was a form of renewable energy that didn't really help us at peak times when we needed it. When we talk about incentives and financing, most projects that you're going to see get done in Texas today are going to be done under what's called a power purchase agreement, where someone else is going to put up the money up front for the cost of the system, And whether you're a business, a hospital, a county, a city, what you're going to do is sign a long-term contract to buy the electricity out of that system. And it may be on your roof, it may be on the ground. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference, actually. Another really creative solution that we've implemented a lot for customers are putting up parking structures over parking lots and solar panels on the top. We find that a lot of students and employees like to have their car parked in the shade in the summer in Texas, and if you can get that, make that essentially pay for itself, it's pretty much a no-brainer. Right now, we don't have much in the way of localized grants or incentives. It's very specific utility to utility and not real compelling. You can see here on the screen a list of some of the utilities that have incentive programs going. What I can tell you is at the level that those currently exist, there will be no, large run of solar projects happening in Texas. Denise is going to share with you in a couple of minutes about some creative things that the City of Harlingen did to make their project work. So you might be wondering, for a guy who's supposed to be in the renewable energy business, you're not exactly painting a real rosy picture of how we should all sign up and do projects with you. And what I would tell you is that today, the main thing I want you to take away is when you're talking to your representatives, your senators, all of the folks who can influence what we do relative to a grid and renewable portfolio standard in the state of Texas, tell them that you want a renewable portfolio standard and you want incentives and programs that keep our power system and our grid stable at peak times and that reduce the amount of rate impact you feel from your utility buying megawatt hours of power on the spot market in August. And we need a more balanced approach in Texas, honestly, between solar and wind. Some of the details that we point out here, most of today's rebates are about $250 a watt, best case. A good rule of thumb for installed cost of a solar system on your roof today might be $4.50 to $5 a watt, depending on how you want it designed, how much flexibility, portability you might want. If you're close to the coast and you need to have a certain amount of hurricane tolerance. We did a big project in Puerto Rico for the U.S. Coast Guard, and most of that's roof mounted. As you can imagine, in Puerto Rico, you have to design for some pretty strong winds. For the future, again, the message we need to take to our leaders and the folks who set our rates, the folks who design our laws, are we need one net metering standard in Texas. We need a renewable portfolio standard that's going to enable a more balanced approach to renewables for us as ratepayers and as business owners and the folks that are responsible for operating public entities in the state of Texas. What I'd like to do at this point is turn it over to Denise so that she can share some details with you about a successful project that's happened right here in the Valley and get a little bit more specific about what it took to make that project come together.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So what we want to do with the City of Harlingen is, first of all, this is a picture of the City of Harlingen celebrating the second phase of their sustainability plan. The City of Harlingen, actually, before everyone started thinking about solar and about grants and renewable, before it became widely known that there were all these green initiatives and sustainability and those types of things, back in 2004, they actually started thinking about ways in which to reduce their consumption, ways in which they could become more sustainable as a city. And the reason that I have it up here is because it's a very, very good case study to show you how some of the myths that are out there on solar photovoltaic systems are, well, not true. A lot of the things that I've heard is, one of the things that I've heard is that everyone's a candidate for this. A lot of people think that they can easily just throw up some solar panels in their roof and then all of a sudden just not have to pay an electric bill. Believe it or not, a lot of people believe that they can throw up some solar panels and they won't have to pay for an electric bill. The other thing is that it's a one-size-fits-all type of measure. You can just go out somewhere, buy a panel, put it up on your roof and it's going to work. And it's not the case. As Shon was just mentioning, in Puerto Rico, they had to rate it for 140-mile-an-hour wind because they're susceptible for hurricanes. Very similar here in the valley, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail here in a bit. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is that there's sort of a path, or a right, not necessarily the right path, but a good path to take if you want or are interested in renewable technology at your facilities, especially if you're a public entity. And the City of Harlingen, this is the path that they took. What they did was back in 2004, when they were just starting to think about this and saying, you know, we're paying too much for electricity, we want to be sustainable, we want to be green. What we did is we went into the city and conducted a citywide audit. What we did was we were just looking for any ways in which they could conserve energy, any way in which they could become more sustainable, and we ended up finding a very substantial amount of savings for the city. As a matter of fact, we've already saved them over $1 million in just energy conservation measures. So the first step was, first, how do we reduce our consumption? Not how do we generate, but how do we reduce our consumption? And the way in which they reduced their consumption, we actually installed an energy management system to control their heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system to ensure that it was on when it was supposed to be, off when it wasn't supposed to be on. We installed efficient AC systems in place. We also retrofitted their lighting. And this was back when lighting wasn't something that everybody was already doing. This was pretty innovative back then. As a matter of fact, they even retrofitted their traffic signals, and they were one of the first cities here in the valley to actually have the LED traffic signals put in place. They even installed what are called vending misers. What those are is just a control system for your soda machines. It turns out they had enough soda machines there that they could generate some savings from their soda machines, from being able to control them. And then in 2009, when all these grants came about, the economy, unfortunately went into a recession, but that opened up opportunity for there to be the stimulus funds and for everybody to get some free money. Of course, the City of Harlingen, always being forward-thinking, they went ahead and applied for one of those grants, but they found themselves in a bit of a quandary. What do we spend it on if we've already taken all of these measures? And then they had us run another audit and see, okay, well, with the new technology, is there an opportunity for us to save further? Is there anything else that we didn't look at that we can look at now? And we determined and we told them, hey, we'd like to sell you some more energy conservation measures, but there's really not a whole lot else that you can do at your facilities. You're doing a good job of maintaining. You've installed all these energy conservation measures. Not a whole lot you can do. And they said, well, but we want this funding, so what else can we do? So what we did was we actually found that one of their roofs, and this is the Lonsea Hill facility. It's basically an administrative office where people go get birth certificates, things like that. We found that their roof was flat there, and we conducted a study to see if solar would be a good fit there. Now, this is a facility that's already running efficiently, so it's already been reduced about as much as it could. The only new technology that we found there that we could implement were controls on their computers, and I believe someone mentioned that this morning. There's some savings that you can generate from that, from making sure that they're shut down at a certain hour, that periods of idleness are taken into account, those types of things. But solar was the main key thing that their grant was able to fund. And what we found was that we could offset 33% of the usage, which probably doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you think about it, this building is already efficient, and 33% is a pretty sizable chunk of what they were spending on utilities. And what they did was basically they put in a long-term asset in place there. There's an elementary school next door that the kids can go and visit and look at the solar panels. It's going to be there. It's basically there as a teaching tool for the city. It's there to set the example. It is there to basically so that they can be the leaders in this technology. The stimulus funds, if anything, the good thing that came out of the recession is that we increased demand for solar panels. And by increasing demand, you eventually we're going to get to where this pays for itself and where this is a good fit for people. It turned out to be a very good fit for the City of Harlingen. And if you can see from this slide, it equates to removing 1,160 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, eliminating over 2 million driving miles from the roads, and planting 34,000 trees. And I just wanted to point you to the link down here where here's the link to their home website. And what you will find here is that they have two sections on their home website. Here is their energy management summary report. This is, and we had one of our speakers talk about this earlier, the measurement and verification aspect of installing these energy efficiency measures, of putting these projects into place. What effect are they having? They've already saved over $1 million here, as you can see from that graph. They have all these details available to show their constituents. And going back here to their main page, if I can do that. Shon, could I have some IT help?
When you're calling me for IT help, we're in deep trouble.
Then here they can see the second phase of their sustainability path, which is the production that they've had for the past month. It's kind of a snapshot of their solar array there. And they have this up so that their constituents can look at it and can see the initiatives that their city has taken on. Not sure how to get out of there. Not my forte. But what I wanted to show you was just basically this is the ideal path that a public entity would take into being able to install these measures and to make this affordable and to make it sort of make sense conceptually to have these types of measures put in place. Some of the things that were incorporated as part of this PV system, it has a unique racking system in place that is not only apt for 130-mile-an-hour wind, apt for the hurricane conditions here, for the hail. It's also mobile. The city asked us to make it mobile in case they decide to change their office facilities. They can actually take these panels off and move them into another facility and put them on the roof. So this actually does not void their roof warranty. And like I said, it's a long-term asset. It's going to be in place for over 20 years. It does have a warranty on it. And it's in a facility where we had to actually work with the Historical Commission to make sure that we designed properly so as to not inhibit the historical aspect of the facility. So we had to do a lot of the reporting and things like that in order to obtain this grant, but in the end it was a very successful project, and I think it's a great example. Great thing to have here in the Rio Grande Valley. It's one of the first solar panel installations in a city facility. So, Shon, do you want to go ahead and add?
Yeah, at this point, we had originally intended to have a live demo of a 1 megawatt field that we have in place at one of our facilities in Smyrna, Tennessee. It's a research and development field that we put in. The good news is we're testing out some new products there that we think can drive more cost, better efficiency. Bad news is the field is actually down today while they're putting the new products in and taking some of the older stuff out. So we're not going to be able to see that. Hopefully from what Denise shared with you from the Harlingen website, and I'd encourage you all to go there and check out myharlingen.com and go in there and you can see the dollar savings or cost avoidance based on their own generation that's going on, as well as the energy efficiency progress that they've made. I would say at this point, we'd definitely be willing to field any questions that anyone would have, and then make a couple of final comments and we'll wrap up. Is that okay?
Good. Take any questions you have.
Yes, sir.
Realizing that you have a multitude of experiences nationally and internationally, what are the one or two things you can pick out about an entity like the City of Harlingen that embraced this back in 2004 versus entities that you see now in 2012 that still don't get it and say, you know, we're not quite there yet, we're going to, in about 5 years, we're going to be there. What are the common denominators you see and to compare and contrast one versus the other?
Common denominators as far as between entities that are forward-thinking and proactive versus the ones that are starting to think about it now just because it's out there? Well, that's exactly what it is. I mean, you just have to have proactive people within your organization. People within your organization that are always looking for the next thing and are thinking long-term rather than short-term. A lot of the times we see that some of our clients or potential clients fall into kind of a rut where they're kind of just, you know, faced with the daily operations. They're trying to survive, and we understand that it's difficult, you know, to deal with the day-to-day situations. But sometimes it's good to take a look at what is the long-term vision that I want for my organization. What is it, you need to ask yourself, what is it that I want to leave in place? When I'm no longer working for this city or no longer working for this university, what is it that I want to leave behind to my predecessor, the next person that takes this position, or to the university as a whole, to the entity as a whole, or to the community? And I think that's a lot of what happened with the City of Harlingen, is that they wanted to leave something in place for the community. Something they wanted to go on a sustainability path, and as a matter of fact, they still ask us, well, what else can we do? You know, and that's what you have to keep. That's the position that I think is ideal for you to take, is what else can I do? And not be satisfied with where you are at the present time.
At Harlingen, was there an ROI, was it more of a community project for educational purposes?
Well, I think if you back up a step, I mean, to echo what Denise shared, they had a strategy. They had already done a lot of conservation work that had a very, very quick payback, positive ROI. Because they had a partner on board, that they could be more opportunistic, and when the stimulus program came along, they could say, we already know where we stand, so here's some money that we may be able to get that could take something that honestly, in and of itself for them, at that point in time, probably was a 25 to 30 year payback, and make it something much, much less than that. But if they hadn't already done a lot of conservation work and put a strategy in place, it's difficult to be opportunistic when those types of grants come along. So I would say, number one, think about how energy can be managed as a part of your ongoing strategy. And, you know, I realize, I mean, we live in a world where it's all we think about every day. So it's a little easier for us. You guys live in a world where all you think about is whether it's educating students or making patients well or keeping prisoners safe and secure, whatever it is that your entity does. So partner with somebody who can essentially keep an eye on that for you, and then when you see an opportunity, they could pick up the phone and call Denise and say, you know, here's what we've done, but we see an opportunity for some funding here. How can we leverage that, or how can we take advantage of it? And I think, you know, I heard it come from 2 or 3 speakers in there, and I would echo what they shared, which, you know, cool roof technology, LEED certification, energy management systems, all those things are just tools. And no more than you can back up a pickup truck full of tools and expect a house to get built, can you expect someone who owns all these tools to have efficient buildings. At the end of the day, it takes people to make those things happen. And if you're not creating a culture, I love the first speaker when he talked about the pressure that a school board member or administrator might feel if they're going to push for an efficient building, and maybe the local contractor that's used to getting most of the work doesn't have a system that can meet that standard. The pressure that they're going to feel, because I've dealt with a lot of school districts over the years, to modify what they're asking for to suit the local contractor can be immense. And so for the city, if they don't have a strategy in place and they're just going to say, hey, maybe we should go look at solar, they're going to get a lot of pressure to do things in a certain way that may not be best for the city. Ultimately, what you want is the most cost-effective solution that lasts a long time and enables you to focus on your core competency and your core mission, whatever that is.
The other thing I wanted to mention, and it was something that I thought of as I was listening to the speakers this morning, is that sometimes we do also get stuck with the first cost of things. But when you're when you're working for a public entity, and like I said, it kind of goes back to looking at that long-term vision. The first cost is only about 25% of what you actually need to worry about, especially if you're a maintenance director or an operations director. What you're putting in place, like a facility that you erect, that facility is going to cost you some additional funds. Those funds account for about 75% of the total cost of just having a facility. So you have to think of, what are my operational costs? The easy way that I found to explain this, and it may be kind of cheesy, but you know, sometimes they give you a free phone, but how much do you pay for it a month? You know, that's why they give you a free phone, because where they're going to make their money is with how much they bill you every month. So if you think of when you're building a facility, think of it that way. Okay, to put this structure up, it's only going to cost me 25% of what I'm actually going to pay for it. And I'm going to have to live with it for, how long do you have your facilities in place? 30 years, 40 years? I've been in some school buildings that have been in place since the 1930s. You know, so you have to, you know, think about the long-term vision there. So. And by the way, with the City of Harlingen, they did get a little bit of a monetary benefit as far as, aside from the grant, they did get an $87,500 rebate. So it's always good.
$7,500 rebate?
Oh no, 87,500
From their utility.
from the
Commercial
utility.
standard operating program.
Correct,
Yep.
yeah, but for the solar specifically.
Other questions?
You mentioned that most people just think you just go pick up a solar panel and put it up. What is the process? Like,
Well, first we had to run a study. Like I said, one of the ways in which we probably was a good candidate was just, we were walking up on their roof, conducting an audit, making sure that building envelope was good, making sure that ACs were running properly, etc. And one of my engineers says, this is a really flat roof. Pretty much have nothing up on there. And so I told the client that, and I said, well, you could potentially use it for solar panels. And so we went and ran a study as far as, what would it take to actually install solar panels here? We had to go back to the roofing manufacturer. We had to go and talk to a bunch of different people to find out, well, how long is the warranty for the roof? What is the structure comprised of? That type of thing. Will it actually withstand this much weight on the roof? And we actually went back and revisited our design a few times, especially because since we were using grant funding, we had to comply with the historical society. Of course, I mentioned that. We also had to comply with, of course, the city codes, and then the hurricane rating, 130 mile an hour. So you have to go through that whole process. It's not just the infrastructure itself that you have to look at, but it's all the codes and all the regulations and just all the compliances. And then once you get through that and figure out, okay, it cannot go over, and of course this is an arbitrary number, it can't go over 20 pounds or the roof's going to cave in. Okay, well we have to design for 20 pounds. It can't, it has to withstand 130 mile an hour wind. So let's make sure the system is out for that, etc. And then of course they threw in, we want it to be able to be moved to another facility. So, okay, how do we make this mobile yet sturdy? So those are the types of things you have to consider. And I can tell you, solar panels here in the valley, it's completely different than solar panels out in some other place in the United States. Solar panels in California, solar panels in the East Coast.
Can I build on that a little bit? I mean, it's things like, what direction does the roof face? If you have a sloped roof, if you have a flat roof, you notice, I don't know if you could tell in the pictures, but those panels are going to be up at an angle. Well, based on where you're located, what is the right angle to maximize the impact of the sun? One of the things not many people know about solar panels is they're most effective when the sun's shining at a 90-degree angle perpendicular to that panel. Just as the sun begins to set slightly and you're no longer at 90 degrees, the effectiveness of the panel's generating capability drops off substantially. So designing the system right from the get-go is very important in terms of maximizing the return on investment.
It used to be, I was afraid to use design engineer, it used to be a bi-directional agreement, for serve and send energy was a killer 25 years ago. Now it's an easier problem. It's everything else you got to deal with.
But those, just like when you think about building a new house, if you've never done it before, it sounds like a pretty massive undertaking and complex. When you talk to somebody that builds homes for a living, they do it in their sleep. It's a little bit similar. What I tell people, solar is not rocket science. I mean, this is, when I talk to people that own buildings, if you have a chiller plant has about 1 million variables that, based on the water flow and building occupancy and all these other things, scaling on the cooling tower, blah, 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 that impact how that operates. With a PV system, if you design it right from the get-go and hook it up right, and you've made the right assumptions about the amount of solar radiance you get in the location you're in, and you don't have shade on the roof, etc., it's going to work. Again, not rocket science. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I just have a comment. As being a current school board member, this has been very, very enlightening. And one of the things that I recommend to anybody and everybody is the audit. You cannot argue with black and white. Because if you go and you say, well, I'm going to buy a dress, I'm not going to try it on, I'm just going to buy it. Then you get home and maybe it's too big or too small or whatever. And so when you do, for the school districts, I know that we have done business, and this is not an advertisement for Schneider. We just happened to do business with Schneider, and when we first got it, I've been on the school board for 18 years, and I looked at it and said, okay. I really was not too much into it, but when they came back and they gave us a report, And then when they came back and gave us a check, I was like, okay, I think this is going to get interesting. But what I really appreciated was that consistent information to the board members. And eventually, you know, as board members, we will get it. I mean, that may not be our forte to understand energy. But when you talk about it's going to save you money, and especially right now that we're facing the funding cutbacks and what have you, we need to look at every corner to and my work director. Yeah, well, somebody told me that, you know, a school district may say, oh, we're going to buy, spend X amount of money to buy laptops because we're going to save, blah, blah, blah. But then if their buildings are falling apart or not being energy efficient, well, you could have still bought those laptops if you had done this other part. And see, as board members, sometimes we don't think about stuff like that. So it constantly has to be in our face, you know, what needs to happen. So I certainly appreciate this so very much. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And it's on the burden. We all have the burden, not just us with Schneider Electric, but all of you that are working for the finance people or board members or whoever you report to in your entity, or maybe you are the finance people or the board members. To her point, you need data. You know, we can't just go into a meeting just like I can't go to my boss and say, hey, I kind of got this idea. I'd like to spend a few $million on this. He's going to say, why do you think that's a good idea? And if I'm really thinking, I will have told him that on the front end. You know, we've got to dig and capture some data. And you know, at the risk of sounding like I'm giving a plug for everybody that spoke today, here's what I would tell you if you own buildings. Thinking about each of these things as discrete elements will be the least efficient way for you to maintain and operate that building over time. Where you can really start to get some bang for the buck is when you say, you know what, so if I go back to the first gentleman that spoke, gosh, we've got this old chiller that we need to replace. Hey, you know what, 2 or 3 years out, we probably need a new roof. Well, you know what, if you make the right roofing choice, you might actually be able to buy a smaller chiller. But so often we look at these as, well, I'm going to budget for the chiller this year, and then I'm going to budget for the roof next year, and then the year after that I'm going to do X and Y and Z. If we were to actually tackle those things at the same time and do a lighting retrofit, change the chiller, change the roof, I can buy a smaller chiller, I can run a whole lot more efficiently. But I understand you're sometimes up against those funding constraints where you're talking to the CFO or the board. You've got to take them the data to show them, look, yes, technically, we were planning on replacing this chiller in 2 years, but since we're doing the roof, I mean, we can't run 2 years with less chiller capacity waiting to do the roof. Let's tackle these things today, and here's the benefit that it can have. So I guess that would be kind of my final 2 cents. It would be, think about these things as a system, because all of these things work together to make your buildings work.
Yeah, if anything that you get from today is you have to really analyze what, if you are looking at what's cheapest, this is a way of looking at what's cheapest. By taking everything together and looking at it as, okay, this thing affects this, this affects that, seems pretty scientific, so let me look at it as a whole and figure out how I'm really going to take control of my facilities, how I'm going to take control of cost. And not just for today, but for the long term. That's what we would advise you.